It feels like the movie industry just keeps chugging along with releases that are superhero flicks, sequels, Oscar bait, or reboots or remakes. I could argue that this industry is simply out of ideas, but there are some genuinely good movies that get released that sometimes fall into any one or multiple of these categories. Really, these movies are made by studios that are backed by major corporations, and if there's one thing corporations care about, it's making money. These categories are guaranteed money makers, at least that's what their various marketing departments say. The video game industry is often the same way, though they are more defined by the budgets that their parent companies and corporations give them. This often delineates their ranking as a AAA, AA, or even indie status. Just like mirroring the movie industry, the video game industry has gone back to the well and started releasing reboots, remakes, and remasters of beloved games. This isn't anything new for this industry. This has occurred as early as the adventure game for the Atari 2600 in 1980 based off of the 1970s text adventure. Resident Evil 1 for the GameCube in 2002 immediately comes to mind as one of the best and well-known remakes. We also have Final Fantasy VII Remake released in 2020, which is a remake in name only, as it adds in a metric ton of additional content and solely focuses on the first 8 hours of the original released in 1997. And of course, Tetris has been remade and re-released a number of times since its inception in the early 1980s. There are a ton of classic games that I think deserve the remake treatment. I've asked a few of my gaming buddies which games they believe should be remade, and thus they've influenced my list. One thing to note is that I want these to be complete remakes from the top down. This means I don't want another port or something like The Last of Us 1 for the PS5, where they say it's remade from the top down, but it used the assets from the PS4 version and just updated the graphics. Even something like what Square Enix did with Final Fantasy VIII Remaster would be fantastic, though not what they did with Chrono Cross. Also, my list of games here will be devoid of any Final Fantasies. This is my favorite series, but I feel like this is the low-hanging fruit for me to pick. Also, Square Enix is working on remakes of Final Fantasy IX and Tactics, and had released the pixel remasters of 1 through 6. Shining Force 2. Sega Genesis / Mega Drive, released originally October 19, 1994. This suggestion came from my buddy Hardicus. I've only played about an hour of this game to grab some of the beat roll footage that you see here, but even in my short amount of gameplay, I can tell this is a quality strategy RPG, something in the vein of Fire Emblem. Hardicus had praised the good story and cast of characters as well as the fun strategic battles. He also liked the upgrade system to optional classes via items, thereby empowering the party. I was a Nintendo fanboy growing up. I had all the Nintendo systems, yet I only had Sonic 2 and Sonic & Knuckles for the Sega Genesis that we had. In the last couple years, I've played more and more games from the Sega Genesis than I'd ever played before. And man, games like Shining Force 2 make me wish I had invested equal time to this system. The easy money would be a remake exploiting an anime aesthetic similar to how a Fire Emblem looks. What I would like to see though is something similar to the 80s and 90s Saturday morning cartoons aesthetic, like what He-Man and G.I. Joe had here in the United States. Having that 90s aesthetic mesh with this early 90s game, but with updated and streamlined gameplay and a remastered soundtrack would be phenomenal. Suikoden II. PlayStation 1, released originally on August 31st, 1999. Another suggestion from Hardicus, this is another one that I haven't played. I really crapped the bed missing out on a lot of the PS1 generation's RPGs. Yeah, of course I played and owned Final Fantasy 7 through 9, but it's near criminal I missed Suikoden. Hardicus had suggested to me the series themselves, along with the Shining Force series, but recommended the second entry for both series. He said Suikoden 2's features 108 playable characters, a growing base of operations, as well as good combat. Being an old person, I like that it's turn-based. I heard of Suikoden by reputation, especially with awesome YouTube content creators like Davidinc really recommending it. The original entry features CD quality music and fantastic, colorful sprites with pre-rendered backgrounds. A remake would have an orchestrated soundtrack and have the HD 2D look that games like Octopath Traveler and Triangle Strategy have. They could also add voice acting to all the dialogue. The quality of voice acting nowadays is so much better than the days when Suikoden II originally released. This game was created by Konami. They're not interested in releasing new entries of games, but they've been doing a great job of allowing other development companies such as M2 take their properties and release collections and ports of their work. If they could allow a smaller company like Rabbit and Bear Studios... Oh wait, they're already working on a Suikoden? Wait, never mind, it's a spiritual successor to the Suikoden series. This newer series looks promising, but I still hold out hope for Konami to allow a remake itself of Suikoden II. Asura's Wrath, PS3, released originally February 21st, 2012. This one is a recommendation from my buddy Run. I've never played or even heard of this game before he mentioned it. He said it's basically a large QTE game, but basically the best Dragon Ball Z thing never called DBZ. Give me that in 4K 120 FPS and I can rest easy. I personally dislike games that are too heavy with the QTEs, as to me it feels more like an interactive storybook rather than a full-fledged video game. Regardless, the hook of it being a DBZ-like anime sounds intriguing. Sony released a remake of Demon's Souls from the PS3 onto the PS5, so honestly I don't see why Capcom couldn't do the same thing with Asura's Wrath. Let's add to the fact that Capcom is swimming in money, thanks to the success of its franchises like Monster Hunter and Resident Evil, so investing a team to remaster this game further sounds less far-fetched, and the remake could just be called a complete edition, so fans of the original know they won't have to buy DLC just to see the true ending. It'll come with it when they buy the game. What would hurt its chances is the fact that Asura's Wrath's sales overall were rather abysmal, with slightly less than 500,000 units sold worldwide. Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Ages and Seasons, Game Boy Color, released originally May 13th, 2001. Okay, so from here on out, all of these are my own choices, though a few of my buddies did also suggest a couple of these as well, but I already had them in presence of mind to have here. Surprisingly made by Capcom and not Nintendo's own development team, these two entries essentially feel just like Link's Awakening for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but with a number of concepts pulled from Ocarina of Time. This is standard 2D overhead Zelda gameplay, so no surprises there. And based on the titles themselves, we get more of a time travel dynamic with ages and the season changing with seasons. I never really got into both of these games, but I feel this is where a remake would make both games more palatable for me. It could follow the same aesthetic as the Link's Awakening remake done on the Switch, as well as combine both games onto one cart. The original two games had the player enter passwords to transfer data from both games. Instead of this, since the remake would have both games in one cart, transfer of data would be super easy. This would also allow a lot more cohesive movement into the Ganon-related story portion once both games are completed. Soulblazer, SNES, released originally November 27, 1992. This is the first entry of a trilogy of games from Enix. After this came Illusion of Gaia, then TetraNinja. The latter entry was only released in Japan and PAL regions. The US never got an official release. I do hope Square Enix releases a collection packing these three games, and hopefully the original ActRaiser, into one cart. While TetraNinja is objectively the best game of this lot, I have a special fondness for Soulblazer. I'd also like to see if it can get a larger audience than what it got on its original release, as it's also known to be a fairly rare cart to find. Gameplay for Soulblazer is overhead action RPG with experience points and leveling, where the protagonist must clear out layers of monsters to help unlock people and portions of villages from lands he is journeying to. For the remake, I could see this going the Trials of Mana route and just going full 3D action RPG like Kingdom Hearts and Ys 8 and 9. Personally though, I'd prefer if they kept the original style, though maybe they could use 3D anime models placed into this 2D space. The music and sound effects are similar to ActRaiser, with some samples of the latter being pulled directly from this game. With a wonderful soundtrack, this would sound fantastic fully updated and orchestrated. Even though ActRaiser Renaissance was a disappointment, that's a fine example of what I'd like to see Square Enix do for a Soulblazer remake in regards to the music. Star Tropics, NES, released originally on December 1st, 1990. While this game was developed in Japan by Nintendo, it only was ever released in the US and PAL regions. It features RPG-like overworld movement, but with Zelda-like gameplay once in each chapter's respective dungeons. The main character, Mike Jones, controls a bit stiff, cannot move diagonally, though he can in the sequel, and enemies can easily swarm poor Mike if he's not ready. This is another example of a game that is NES hard, not just because of the difficult enemies, but also it can get confusing where to go in both dungeons and even the overworld without a guide. Still, the gameplay is solid, the story is pretty decent, and the music is great. The remake should keep the overworld aesthetic, though updated to a 16-bit version, much like how Dragon Quest XI's 2D mode shows its overworld. There is a number of things they can do to improve the quality of life for the game, such as allow Mike to move diagonally and freely, provide explanations for weapons that are gained in dungeons, give Mike a longer number of invincibility frames when he gets hit by enemies. When Mike gets a weapons upgrade, make it permanent. Don't lock it behind a health requirement. Indicate the player where they should go next on the overworld. Give the player a map of the dungeon that can be viewed if hitting select, as well as a mini-map on screen. Some bosses require items gained during dungeon exploration to beat them. Give the player some sort of indication that picking these up are important for the boss later. And finally, get rid of the 747 MHz entry, or make it an item that needs to be picked up in that chapter. Yeah, it's a long list, and I've been sitting on this one for a long time. This game is so good and has so much potential, but there's so much that can be done to improve it and bring it to a new generation. Super Mario Bros. 1 through 3 and World, released on the NES and SNES. Yes, I know the first 3 Super Mario Bros. Games were remade for the Super Nintendo as Super Mario All-Stars. Later versions of All-Stars included Super Mario World on the cartridge, with the other 4 games as well. Nintendo should take a page out of Sonic Origins' playbook of redoing all of these games in widescreen. Yes, that would impact how enemies appear, spawn, and move, but that's where the additional effort of remaking them should also be employed. I loved how Super Mario Maker essentially added widescreen support for Super Mario Bros. 1, 3, and World. This is how I would see all of these games playing. If Nintendo wanted to, they could add additional levels, much like how they did with the e-reader version of Game Boy Advance's Super Mario Bros. 3, aka Super Mario Advance 4. Also like Sonic Origins, they should include the original versions of these games as well, both the NES and SNES versions, respectively. Where Origins failed in overall polish and high pricing, Nintendo could succeed due to the high standards of development they have, as well as the overall perceived value that first-party Nintendo games seem to have. The argument against this is that Nintendo wouldn't double dip since these titles are all available on the NSO, as well as through user-created versions via Super Mario Maker 2. However, Super Mario 64 is available through the NSO's expansion pack, as well as Super Mario 3D All-Stars on the Switch. Ocarina of Time, Nintendo 64, originally released November 21st, 1998. Link's Greatest Adventure exists already on the NSO's expansion pack, as well as on the 3DS. The original N64 version is great, though the early polygonal style ages it quite a bit, especially compared to today's graphics. The NSO version definitely had its issues, such as odd glitches and graphic presentation. It's no secret that I dislike the 3DS, what with the terrible circle stick and the hokey 3D slider. This 3DS version is still a great remake for its time, though again it is limited by the hardware it's on. A number of fans have expanded the resolution of the 3DS remake to scale 4K and 60 FPS, and it looks glorious. This is what I would imagine a remake looking like on the Switch, or on its successor, the Super Nintendo Switch. Get it to 4K or at least 1440p, nail that 60 FPS marker, and it would truly feel like Link's Greatest Quest. Obviously, a remake would include all of the bonuses from the 3DS version, including the Master Quest and the Boss Rush modes. Not much else to say, except get it done, Nintendo. Crystalis, NES, released originally July 1st, 1990. This is quite the cult hit made by the company SNK. It has a story that is introduced right as the game boots up, featuring the world ending on October 1st, 1997. It sees the player exploring a world where magic and swordplay reign supreme, gaining elemental swords and using their abilities to clear the path and unlock further areas. I remember this being classified as a Zelda clone when it first came out, though nowadays I would say that this game really cleared its own path, with other games taking a beat from its example. Regardless, the game itself is bright and colorful, gameplay and battling is smooth and fantastic, and it features one of the best original soundtracks on the NES. One game similar to this would be Ys 6, Ark of Napishtim, released in September of 2003. Both games feature the elemental swords with action RPG gameplay, though Napishtim handled things like the equipment switching much better. This is where I feel a remake or reboot of Crystalis is sorely needed. One annoying part with the original entry is switching swords, as well as equipping the ball and bracelet power-ups. A simple button press would allow the player to switch swords, while these ball power-ups would be auto-equipped accessories once the sword has been switched. The further power-up of the bracelets actually use player magic points when they are deployed. Either remove this and depower these attacks, or perhaps auto-equip the bracelets and allow magic point use of these bracelet abilities with yet a different button. Crystalis was ported and released on the Game Boy Color in June of 2000, and the less we have to say about this version, the better. Essentially, this port changed the story a fair bit, completely changed the soundtrack to something worse, and dumbed down quite a few things like invulnerabilities enemies had to some of the swords. This is what makes doing a remake from the NES version so essential, as pulling from the Game Boy Color port would be just awful. I would love a fully redone and orchestrated version of the NES version of the soundtrack. Maybe a couple of other quality of life improvements like a better translation and warnings to prevent the player from fighting a boss under-leveled would be great as well. Chrono Trigger, SNES, released originally March 11, 1995. This game itself features a silent protagonist joined by an eclectic cast of characters from theirs and other time periods, coming together to face an enemy that threatens their very world. It also was one of the first games to feature multiple endings, though this depends only on when the player beats the game during the events of the story itself. Squaresoft put together a literal dream team of Japanese RPG developers to make this game. They had Akira Toriyama of Dragon Ball fame and Dragon Quest graphic design, Nobuo Uematsu, the musical composer for the Final Fantasy series, Yuji Horii, the creator of the Dragon Quest series, and Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of the Final Fantasy series. Guided by Kazuhiko Aoki, they created this masterpiece, probably one of the greatest video games ever made, and especially combining Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest team members before the Square Enix merger. So how the heck do you remake a masterpiece like this game? Simple. You don't change a damn thing in the story or gameplay. The best way this could get remade would be in the HD 2D styling of Octopath Traveler and Live Alive. The original version had one of the best looking pixelated art styles for its time. Expanding that in the 2D HD style would be stunning, along with what they could show the myriad of environments that Chrono and his party explore in the game. Add into that a complete orchestral remake of the soundtrack, and Square Enix will literally be printing money. Funny enough though, Chrono Trigger does have a small history regarding remakes. Again, I'm not talking about ports. Do note this was ported to the Nintendo DS, first with additional throwaway content and links to the sequel game Chrono Cross. This additional contented port was released on mobile devices and Steam and nothing else. One of the YouTube content creators I follow, PlayerEssence, has mentioned that to his knowledge, there were 2 attempts made in the past to remake Chrono Trigger, but both failed as they didn't live up to the original's high pedigree. There, of course, was the fan remake, Chrono Resurrection, started in 2003, though Square Enix put the kibosh on this in September 2004 before its Christmas '04 release date. 18 years after this fan attempt, and Square Enix still has done nothing themselves to remake this masterpiece. With the Nvidia leak showing remakes for Final Fantasy IX and Tactics, as well as already announced and released Tactics Ogre, ActRaiser, and Chrono Cross, yet nothing for Chrono Trigger, I'm not confident they're planning anything anytime soon. Did I miss any entries that need remakes? So most of my list contained RPGs or story-driven games, but perhaps that's because these deserve additional looks and to be brought into our modern era with a fresh coat of paint. I do worry about the feasibility for all of these to get remakes. After all, companies often prefer to go for games that will make money, like multiplayer games such as Forknife or live service games like Destiny. As mentioned before though, Square Enix seems to have a taste for remaking past entries, so I hope they and other companies continue to do so. What games do you feel deserve remakes? Let me know in the comments section. Please like, subscribe, and click that bell for notification when more videos are published. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.